So, in case you haven't heard, this is like a week where we are going to be continuing this 6-week series on wisdom called Head to the Heart. This week's a little bit different because we're going to be talking about a subject that you may thought weren't allowed to talk about in church, and that's sex. So just to go ahead and clear everything up right off the bat, that's what we're going to be talking about today. So let's go ahead and get all the awkwardness out of the way. It's something that we can do in church, and we're going to do it this morning. Full disclosure, I am recovering from a sinus infection, so my voice is an octave lower, and I may have to cough at some point, just to let you know. Sorry about that. So like I said, we're in the middle of this series called The Head to the Heart, and this whole series has been about kind of breaking down this myth that there's actually a difference between the two. So as Western thinkers, we kind of come to issues of wisdom, and we think that it has something to do with our brains. We think it's an intellectual process, something that we get from a book. And then we start talking about the heart, and we see this as love. We see this as something that is more emotive or feeling-oriented. And honestly, that's just not the case. That distinction, the difference between the head and the heart, is really something that has developed in the last couple hundred years. It's a very Western kind of oriented way of approaching the two. And this series is about reconnecting them, at least, or just realizing that there really isn't a difference between intellect and our physical, emotional well-being, that all of these things are kind of wrapped up in the same set of issues when we read the Bible, when we talk about the heart. And this is evident in the Hebrew Bible. The word in Hebrew for heart is this word lev. And when the Hebrews talked about the lev, when they talked about the heart, wrapped up in all of that was intellectual thinking, decision-making, feelings, doubts, anxiety. All of these things were situated all in this one area that they called the heart, the lev. So even when we see this word in our English translations in the Bible, we need to stop and pause and say, when we see heart in the Old Testament, we're not just talking about feelings or love or desire, but we're talking about wisdom, we're talking about intellect and thinking and all of these other things, decision makings. All of this is wrapped up in this one word. Excuse me. What's really interesting about wisdom, though, in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament, is that in the middle of this conversation about wisdom is this book called Song of Songs. And it's dropped right in the middle of all of these great little pithy sayings of advice and these philosophical discourses. And there's this book called Song of Songs, and it's all about sex. I mean, like, that's it. There's no way for me to slice it up any differently. Like, this is just a book about love and sex. And it's pretty explicit. It's a little erotic. And the ancient authors made no bones about it. Like, sex is something that's to be celebrated. It's a good thing that God gave us, and we feel completely within the bounds of spirituality and completely within the bounds of what's right to talk about how awesome it is in poetry. And so the book of Song of Songs is exactly that. It's a celebration of sex, and it's right in the middle of this conversation about wisdom. And so if ever there was any doubt about the unification of the head and the heart, it's in Song of Songs. Because this is a book that's explicitly devoted to this one thing that we think of as love and sex. So this morning we're going to try to have that approach when we look at it. And I know that you're probably thinking, like, I didn't know that we could talk about sex in church. I thought that and politics were like the two things that we just like all agreed that was not going to come up when we're here. I'm sorry to tell you that you're wrong. Because it's in the Bible. So we should feel free to have this conversation. So just let go of all of the discomfort at this moment and embrace the conversation. The truth is that Song of Songs is actually, in the ancient context, it's not really that much of a weird thing to show up. All the other cultures around Israel had this kind of poetry. The Egyptians had it. The people in Babylon had it. All of the ancient cultures kind of had these greatest hits of these love songs. And they were pretty graphic, just as some songs are today about it. And the difference, though, is that Song of Songs has some advice kind of tucked away in it as well. So as much as it celebrates, it also gives us some advice and some words of warning. So we need to acknowledge that maybe when we come to Song of Songs and we open up the pages, this may not be the book we think it is, okay? So before we get into anything today, we need to talk about what the book is. And in order to do that, we have to start with some things that Song of Songs is not. And the first of these is that Song of Songs is not a theological description or allegory about God's love for Israel or Jesus' love for the church. Okay, those are kind of later theological interpretations, and they have their place in discussion of church history and all that, but that's not what the book was intended to be, okay? The people who kind of came up with those explanations were just really uncomfortable with the fact that the Bible talked about sex, and so they tried to kind of find a way to make it more spiritual. That's not what we're going to do this morning. We're fully going to embrace that this is about sex, okay? So the first thing is a theological description. The second thing is it's not a narrative, okay? The characters and the voices that are in Song of Songs are really not that defined. We know that there's a male speaker, we know that there's a female speaker, and we get that there's kind of this community of voices, this chorus. Apart from that, nobody's really named. Nobody's given a first name. And so to read it, and we're going to see in a second that this is definitely not a narrative, in order to read it correctly, we need to kind of let go of the idea that this is telling a story of how a couple falls in love and then eventually gets married and then like the celebration of the honeymoon, because the book kind of starts off with a honeymoon scene. So that's kind of a not a narrative thing that we want to talk about this morning. The last thing that Song of Songs is not is an explanation or a philosophical discourse about the meaning of love, okay? This book was not written to tell us the do's and don'ts. It is not written to be like this all-inclusive explanation. Everything you'd ever want to know about love is here. It doesn't define everything that we would want to define if we were going to write that, because it's not meant to be that. So these are the things that Song of Songs is not. What Song of Songs is lyrical poetry, okay? And I come into this conversation knowing that that's probably not like your go-to whenever you're on vacation. You're not like, I'm going to go read this lyrical poetry and just lose myself in it because that's what I do on vacation during the summer. I get that most of us are probably like, poetry's that weird stuff that I try to put into a letter to my spouse to make me sound more romantic than I actually am. And maybe the closest thing that you get to poetry is reading Dr. Seuss to your kids, okay? That's like as far as you're willing to go. And that's okay, because poetry is weird. Poetry does weird stuff with language, and that's kind of the point. The job of poetry is to get you to stop, to slow down, and really take in all of these words that we associate with different things and get you to think about this one image or this one subject. And a lot of times it does stuff with language that's just completely unnatural. Sometimes like people just don't capitalize anything, or they use punctuation marks in a weird way, and you're like, I don't understand what's happening here. Like, this doesn't make any sense to me. And I just want to acknowledge that a lot of times we could come, especially to like Song of Songs, flip through some of this and say, this is weird, I don't know what to do with it. So this morning, what we're going to do is we're going to take a few passages, we're going to look at them, but we're going to appreciate them for what they are, and that's poetry. We're going to understand that these are poems written by people who are trying to express exactly what love and sex in a holistic way look like to them. And if you're like other people like me, and poetry is not like your go-to when you're reading, I think it's important to understand why it's so important. So There was a guy named Stephen Burt who gave a TED talk on the subject, why people need poetry. And he says, poems, the patterns in poems, show us not just what somebody thought or what somebody did or what happened, but what it was like to be a person like that. To be so anxious, lonely, so inquisitive, so goofy, so preposterous, so brave. That's why poems can seem at once so durable, so personal, and so ephemeral, like something inside and outside you at once. Poems can help you help you show how you're feeling, but they can also introduce you to feelings, ways of being in the world, people very much unlike you, maybe even people from long, long ago. This morning, I think that's our goal, okay? What he was talking about there, what Stephen Burt is describing, what we are looking at is something from a long time ago, from a bunch of people who do not share our cultural values, who are completely different in the way they communicated them, but that are communicating something so essential about our humanness, an expression of love, of sexuality, that we might encounter when we read this a feeling or a sense of being that we didn't know was possible before. So it's my hope that as we look through these passages, that we get a look at what the biblical perspective on healthy sexuality is, and that we can walk away from it with a different outlook, a different perspective on how we should be embracing it in our own lives. So we're going to jump right into Song of Songs now, and it's the first poem in the book, and like I said, this is not a narrative, because you're going to see we're thrust right into the middle of this passionate scene in chapter 1. And from the female perspective, this is what's said. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is better than wine. Your anointing oils are fragrant. Your name is perfume poured out. Therefore the maidens love you. Draw me after you. Let us make haste. The king has brought me into his bedchambers. We will exult and rejoice in you. We will exult in your love more than wine. Rightly do they love you. So right in the middle of it here, just first poem right off the bat, bedroom scene, just so you know, that's what's happening here. It's just a complete description of saying, hey, let's go to the bedroom. Let's do this. That's how Song of Songs starts. I can see your awkwardness from here. But notice how the language is so sensory. All the senses are included in this poem. The taste of wine, the smell of perfume, the feel of oils. Barry White may as well be playing in the background in this poem, right? I mean, everything else is there. But everything is included, and it's embraced, and it's celebrated. At the end, there appears to be this chorus of voices where we get this we. And we hear these outside voices throughout the Song of Songs. And in a sense, there's this notion that there's a community that's celebrating over this young couple. The sexual intimacy itself, the bedroom scene, is just strictly between the two people. It's very private. But the celebration of the idea of sexuality, the goodness between two people, is actually happening in a community context. Because a healthy perspective of sexuality is a earmark of a good community. And we're going to see this come up later, and we're going to return to this theme. But there are some other elements in Song of Songs. And these are poems where a man and a woman kind of verbally express their delight and their pleasure in the appearance and the experience of sex with that person. These are just very explicit poems about how much this person looks good and how much they enjoy having sex. And that's right there in the Bible. I want you to look at one because the problem with some of these poems is that if you were just kind of reading through on your own without a knowledge of ancient Israel and the ancient world, you might just read over it and like, this is just weird talk about different kinds of stuff. I don't understand what's happening here. So I want to show you one of these poems from the male perspective where he's kind of talking about and complimenting his female partner. And we're going to unpack this a little bit. So the man says, "How beautiful you are, my love. How very beautiful. Your eyes are doves behind your veil. Your hair is like a flock of goats moving down the slopes in Gilead. Your teeth are like a flock of shorn ewes that have come up from the washing, all of which bear twins, and not one among them is bereaved. Your lips are like a crimson thread, and your mouth is lovely. Your cheeks are like the halves of a pomegranate behind your veil. Your neck is like the Tower of David, built in courses. On it hang 1,000 bucklers, all of them shields of warriors. Your two breasts are like two fawns, twins of a gazelle that feed among the lilies. You are altogether beautiful, my love. There is no flaw in you. Now, just going to throw that out there for the guys. If you ever want to feel like you need to copy scriptural compliments to your wife, this one's probably not going to work for you. If you tell your wife that her teeth are like sheep, or that her hair looks like a goat's, or that her breasts are like deer, it's just not going to go well. But in the ancient world of poetry, these are all amazing compliments. And so I want to kind of get back behind what the compliment actually is and see what they're saying here. So if you take the line, your teeth are like sheep, okay? First of all, the reason that animals are used is because these people were mostly farmers. Most of them either grew crops or raised animals. So that their whole world was the livestock world, the crop world. So that's the images that they used. That's like all they had going for them. The other reason with the teeth is in the ancient world, they didn't really have health care or dental care. So the fact that someone had all their teeth and that they were even close to a shade of white meant that that person was really attractive in the mouth department, okay? This was something that was really rare. Not everybody had all their teeth, and most of the time they were probably brown or yellow. So for this woman to have a nice set of chompers is really a great compliment from her man. So if you want to continue this kind of complimenting, everybody likes to hear that they have nice teeth. It's just probably best if you leave livestock out of the conversation. So he also compares her neck to a tower, which is also 100% sure way to get slapped if you say, honey, you got a neck like a tower. But what's actually happening here is there's this military language. And what the man is saying to his woman is that she has this commanding presence about her, that she is strong and fortified, that she's sure of herself, and it's actually a celebration of her power and her strength. This is a very empowering image to ascribe to a female. And the man in this situation isn't just saying that she's just beautiful, she's delicate flower, everything, she's so gentle, but he's also saying, I appreciate that you're a strong woman. So this is one of the great compliments that her man pays her, even though it doesn't look like a compliment to us. And finally, the compliment on the breasts, looking like fawn gazelles, is probably the poet's way of actually just expressing delight in the softness and gentleness of her body. And so this is, if this is too hot for you guys, I'm just telling you, it's in the Bible. It's there. We're not going to skip over it. What we get from this is actually a language and a license to be verbally expressive with the way that we enjoy both the physical appearance of our partners, but also their abstract qualities, the things that we admire about them, even the sexual stuff. It's okay. You can do that. We need to see in Song of Songs here that not only should we not feel guilty about talking about sex or complimenting our spouses and their desirable appearance, but we should feel empowered to do it. Not only should we feel enabled to speak about the sexual attractiveness of our partners, we should feel empowered to talk explicitly about how much we enjoy that with our partners. These expressions of sexual gratification are explicit, and it's an expression of a healthy relationship. Now, there's a lot more of this kind of stuff that I could show you, but I've been advised not to do that. You can do that on your own time, preferably with your spouse nearby, because this stuff is good. But as much as Song of Songs celebrates and talks about the joys of sex, it is not without warnings. Excuse me. It's not without warnings about the dark side of sexuality. For instance, in one scene, the female character is expressing her desires, but at the end, she says this: "I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles or the wild does, do not stir up or awaken love until it is ready." This phrase is repeated throughout Song of Songs like a refrain, and it's this continual reminder that as amazing as all of these desires are, that they are intended for a healthy, holistic, mature relationship that's built on trust so that intimacy can thrive in a way that is free. This isn't just some great, hey, sex is great, do it with as many people as you want. This is a warning that there are consequences, there are strings attached, that sex isn't just a physical thing of pleasure, but it also has these emotional and spiritual strings attached, and that people shouldn't enter into that intimacy until they are ready to commit to this person. Now, Song of Songs does not spell that relationship out for us. And remember that is because this is not a philosophical discourse. This book is not telling you the rules. It's not telling you how you have to do everything, because that's not what kind of literature it is. This is a poem. But we can use our rational skills, and we can also look into the New Testament and say that there's something about a marriage covenant that provides the safest, most stable place for a healthy sexual relationship to happen. And that is kind of controversial to say today in this world, but I firmly believe that it is only within that relationship where two people have committed to walking through everything that life could possibly throw at them, where they can commit to only committing themselves to this person, that this deep sense of intimacy, this deep sense of gratification and pleasure, of safeness and wholeness can be expressed in the way that it was intended to be expressed. And I think Song of Songs warns us of engaging in those relationships where that's not the foundation. Richard Hess is a Hebrew scholar who wrote a lot about Song of Songs. He says, Song of Songs is erotic love poetry that makes no apology for appealing to all the senses that God created. Yet it also affirms that there is an order to this wonderful gift of sex. Its potency and wildness does not mean that there is no restraint. So sex should be something that is experienced within the context of an intimate relationship that I think is most whole and most safe in marriage. And that as great as it is, there are limits. And there is a dark side to it. And the poet goes on to say this, spell it out a little bit more clearly in chapter 2, where speaking as the woman, recalling what her man says to her, she writes this: "My beloved speaks to me and says, 'Arise, my love, my fair one, and come away. For now the winter is past, the rain is over and gone, the flowers appear on the earth, the time of singing has come, and the voice of the turtle dove is heard in our land. The fig tree puts forth its figs, and the vines are in blossom, for they give forth fragrance. Arise, my love, my fair one, and come away. O my dove, in the clefts of the rock, in the covert of the cliff, let me see your face, let me hear your voice. For your voice is sweet, and your face is lovely. Catch us the little foxes that ruin the vineyards, for our vineyards are in blossom.'" So throughout this part of the poem, the poet is expressing through this imagery of spring that they're ready for this relationship now. All the signs are there, spring has arrived, this relationship is in full bloom, and they are ready to have this relationship. But at the very end, there's this warning Through the imagery of the vineyard, which is kind of the symbol of their sexual relationship, the man says to his wife, catch these little foxes. Make sure that nothing comes into this relationship that could destroy it. So just like in a real vineyard, there are pests that come in and destroy the crops. There are these things that try to enter into our relationships that we have that threaten the intimacy, that threaten the trust that we have, the relationship and its foundation. And just as there were these little foxes that threatened to come in and ruin the vineyard of their intimacy back in the ancient world, those challenges still exist for us today, for anyone in a relationship today. And so as I was coming up with some of these, like, what would this look like today? I have a list, and some of these are just pretty bold things to talk about in church. And I want to let you know at the outset that these may feel uncomfortable to you. But these are things that threaten the intimacy of any marriage relationship in here today. And for those of you not in a marriage relationship, I understand that this may not feel like it applies, but these are also things that while you're single could hurt future relationships. And so these are all applicable for us today. The first of the little foxes of today that I thought of was pornography. Pornography, in my opinion, in the opinion of people who study this sort of thing and the effects that it has psychologically, pornography is a false image of sexuality. It's driven by sometimes violence, but its primary existence is for the self-serving gratitude of the viewer. There's no giving, there's no intimacy. It's about gratification 100%. And that, according to Song of Songs and according to a healthy mentality about what sex is not true. Because sex is about two people giving themselves to each other, and pornography disrupts that mindset of sexuality, and it makes it all about the person who is consuming the media. And so pornography is, in my opinion, one of the greatest threats to intimacy because it affects the way the people in a relationship view sexual intimacy with their partner. If it's all about one person, then it's not sexual intimacy. The second thing is inappropriate closeness with someone other than a spouse. If you've heard stories of people that end up having an affair, it always starts off innocently. It always starts off with some simple flirtation or just close proximity. Maybe feelings are shared, things are talked about that aren't necessarily appropriate, and that can spiral out of control. And I think one of those things that can break down a relationship between two people in a relationship of trust is the giving of closeness to someone that is not in the marriage covenant. That's one sure way to allow a fox to come in and ruin the vineyard. Another one, just a little change of pace here, obsession with work. We live in a culture that worships success and exalts people who work 70 hours a week. And there's nothing wrong with being a hard worker and giving and loving your job, but there is a point where your obsession or your commitment to a job can actually break down your relationships so that you aren't giving enough time, you don't have enough space in your life to invest in the intimacy with your spouse. When you're flying around all over the place and you're going to bed at 11 o'clock and waking up at 5, there's just not enough time in the day. It's just a practical thing, okay? And so these pursuits of work at all costs can actually ruin the intimacy that we have. The other one that I came up with is screens, TVs, phones, binge watching Netflix until midnight, laying in bed just scrolling through Facebook or Instagram or Twitter. Like these are just these little images of two people in the same bed but in completely different worlds. And I'm so guilty of this. Like, I will admit to this. Like, I lay in bed at night just checking sports scores or something like that. And that's something that can actually be a barrier to intimacy between two people. And so I would just caution that we make that a practice. Past relationships, past experiences, feelings of guilt, of expressions of intimacy that we've had with other people that we bring into current relationships. These are all things that can be a hindrance, that can be a roadblock to expressing intimacy with someone else, with someone that you're married to. And we're going to get into this a little bit more later. And then the last one is lack of communication. I think sex is just something that, as Christians sometimes, we don't really feel comfortable talking about. And we might have a set of expectations about what sex is or what sex isn't, and we bring those into a relationship and they're not communicated, and so we're either disappointed or we're angry because something's not happening that we thought should. And we need to know as Christians that this stuff is in our Bible, okay? This is something that God wants us to be able to talk about because it is a healthy expression of our being human. And so if we don't communicate those things, then we allow room for a little fox to come in and disrupt possible healthy intimacy with our spouse. There's more that I could add to this list, but the point is that as honest as Song of Songs is about how great sex can be, it's also very clear about the dangers of unhealthy sex and an unhealthy perspective on sex. I know statistically that in a room this size with as many people that are in here, that there are people who struggle with pornography in this room. I know for a fact, based on statistics, that there's probably people in here who have been the victim of sexual violence or know someone close to them who has been the victim of sexual violence. I'm going to share some statistics with you, and these are not for shock value. This is primarily for the understanding that A, you are not alone if something like this has happened to you, but also you need to understand that this is something that people rarely talk about. So these statistics come from the National Center on Domestic and Sexual Violence. And I want to share these with you. Nearly a quarter of women may experience sexual violence in their lifetime. A quarter of girls and a sixth of boys will be sexually molested by the age of 18. Nearly 60% of rape incidents happen in their own home or the friend of a close friend or relative. Only 16% of rapes are even reported to the police. Less than 20% of people feel like they can even talk about this with someone. This is heavy stuff. But I know that when we start talking about this, when we start talking about sex, that if this has been a part of your past, that this conversation in and of itself is a trigger for some really negative stuff in your life. And I want you to know that here is a place where we can talk about it. Some people in this room may have experienced the violated trust of someone close to them. And maybe you feel like sex could never be a good thing because of the past experiences that you've had. And maybe you've never even talked about it with someone else. My hope is that having looked at what Song of Songs says about healthy and holistic sex and love, is that you will see that experience is not what God intended for your life. That experience is not what God intended for you to see sex as. Because God did not write the foxes into the story. The foxes come in on their own to disrupt the good thing that God did create. And those foxes that come in, those negative experiences of sexual violence, pornography, these things that come in, they can be story altering. They can be defining. They can be completely captivating to who you define yourself to be. And this morning, as we look at Song of Songs, we want to come down hard and say, that is absolutely not the narrative that God has for your life. That is absolutely not the story of sex that God tells in the Bible. And so, as your community, we want to offer you the opportunity to talk with someone about that. As I prepared for this message, and I thought about this, I sought the help of some professional counselors and therapists because I did not want to bring something up and not then be able to deliver on what it would take for all of us to be healthy and whole together. And one of the people who helped me out a lot with this was Chris Dorston's wife, Katie Dorston, who is a licensed counselor. And one of the things that we talked about was the need to have a safe place to talk about this, to have someone who is trained in dealing with this so that we can seek wholeness together. And so she has offered to be out at the info booth after this. If you need someone to talk to, someone that's safe, someone that knows what they're talking about and has dealt with this and studied about this, we offer you that opportunity. If that's something that's too public, if that's too much, we also have little cards that we've printed off of trusted firms and counselors that are able to help you walk through this because we want to walk through this with you as a community. We saw at the beginning that this community, these voices, express their love and their happiness at this whole relationship that's being talked about in chapter 1. And that's what we feel like our job as the church is today, is to come around people who have stories of brokenness and people who have stories of wholeness and all walk together in pursuing health and wholeness when it comes to sex. And so we really encourage you to take that step, to not let that stuff be in the darkness, to not let that be hidden in the shadows, but to come out to name it and say, God did not write this into my story. And we want to be there with you as you attempt to walk towards wholeness and write that out of your story. Towards the end of the book of Song of Songs, there is this closing expression of joy and of the power of love. And I want to read that with you as we close, because this is ultimately where Song of Songs comes down on the relationship of love and a healthy expression of sex. It says, "Set me as a seal upon your heart, as a seal upon your arm. For love is strong as death, passion fierce as a grave. Its flashes are flashes of fire, a raging flame. Many waters cannot quench love, neither can floods drown it. If one offered for love all the wealth of one's house, it would be utterly scorned." Ultimately, Song of Songs has this picture of sex that says, if you can find this love, if you can find this expression of love and wholeness in a marriage, there is nothing, none of those little foxes, none of the negative things, none of the evil in this world can overcome the power of love. There is nothing that can stop this force that is love and passion. There is no amount of money that can fill the void of that longing. And there's this great phrase in there where it says that its flashes are like flashes of fire, a raging flame. And that word for raging flame is the Hebrew word shelhabatah, which could mean the fire of God, the fire of Yahweh. And if that's the case, then this is the only time where God's name shows up in the entire book on sex. And if that's true, what we could say about love, about sex, about this healthy perspective that Song of Songs is talking about, is that in the midst of this relationship, that God is present, that his goodness is there in it. In a sense, there's just as much spirituality in love and in sex as there is when God appears to Moses in the burning bush, fire of God. There's just as much spirituality and wholeness as when God gives the 10 Commandments to the Israelites. You see, the reason that sex is included in the wisdom literature is because it is a heart issue. And because it is a heart issue, it is a spiritual issue. And in order to have spiritual wholeness, this is something that we have to address. Because there are these little foxes that try to come and get into the intimacy that we have or will have one day, and they try to destroy what is healthy and whole and good. And if we're going to be a community that values that, if we're going to be a community that reconnects the head and the heart, that pursues wisdom, we have to figure out how to fight for that. In our marriages, in preparing to be married one day, or to be single. We have to find a way to preserve the goodness and fight for the love that God has given to us as humans. There are people here this morning that can help you do that. Don't let the little foxes destroy something good. Let us walk with you towards wholeness. You pray with me. God, ultimately, we just want to say thank you for making us human, for giving us these desires and these relationships that are essentially good. And we just want to stop and acknowledge that there is a possibility for wholeness in all of our relationships to experience what you intended for us. God, my prayer is that for everybody in this room who has a story that's completely different from the person sitting next to them, that they would be able to identify those things that stand to disrupt the goodness that you've created, and that may not be their fault at all. This stuff may not even be on them, but God, I pray that you would bring healing, that you would bring restoration, that you would empower us to keep these little nagging foxes out of our relationships, and that you would heal us and make us whole when it comes to this issue and every issue in our lives. Now we pray this in the name of Jesus.